December 7th, 1941, Hickam Field, Hawaii. Lieutenant Richard Carmichael stood frozen on the tarmac as black smoke rolled across Pearl Harbor, his hands still gripping the flight controls of the B-17C flying fortress he had just brought down through a sky filled with red roundel-marked aircraft. Behind him, 11 more bombers of the 38th Reconnaissance Squadron circled the chaos, unarmed and defenseless, having arrived from California at precisely the moment the Imperial Japanese Navy chose to demonstrate that the Pacific War had begun. Within hours, Japanese pilots would learn the names of these strange four-engine bombers that had somehow survived the gauntlet of attacking Zeros. They called them fortresses. They had no idea how accurate that name would prove to be. Over the next 4 years, Japanese fighter pilots would encounter American heavy bombers in circumstances that would fundamentally challenge everything they knew about aerial combat. The Boeing B-17 flying fortress, when fully armed and operating in defensive formations, would carry 13 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute. That translated to over 9,000 rounds per minute across a single bomber, creating a defensive sphere of fire that no fighter pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained to penetrate. The mathematics of survival would prove devastating. 850 caliber machine guns could deliver fire sufficient to destroy an attacking Zero fighter at ranges exceeding 800 yards. The Japanese pilots, flying aircraft optimized for agility rather than armor, would discover that the same lightweight construction that made their Zeros so maneuverable also made them terribly vulnerable to the heavy American rounds. A single 50 caliber bullet striking an engine, a wing spar, or a fuel line could transform a graceful fighter into a falling torch. But on that December morning, in 1941, with Pearl Harbor burning and Japanese aircraft dominating Hawaiian skies, none of this was yet apparent. The B-17 seconds that survived the attack carried minimal defensive armament. The early C and D models mounted perhaps 4 or 5 machine guns total, scattered across inadequate positions. The crews had no combat experience. The tactics for bomber defense remained theoretical concepts discussed in training manuals, but never tested against determined opposition. What followed would be a race. American engineers would transform the flying fortress from a vulnerable bomber into a bristling weapon platform, while Japanese pilots learned through blood and fire how to attack these increasingly dangerous targets. By the time the transformation was complete, by the time the B-17G model entered service in the summer of 1943, the bomber would mount defensive firepower that Japanese fighter doctrine had never anticipated and Japanese aircraft were never designed to overcome. The story begins not with the finished weapon, but with the evolution. January 1942 found the surviving American bombers scattered across the South Pacific, retreating before the Japanese onslaught that swept through the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. These early fortresses, operating from improvised bases in Java and Australia, carried the hopes of a nation that had just watched its Pacific fleet burn at anchor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The crews learned quickly. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger and the men of the 303rd Bombardment Group discovered on December 12, 1942, what happened when a B-17 fell out of formation. Attacking the Rouen-Souteville Railroad marshalling yards in occupied France, Flickinger's bomber, nicknamed Wolf Hound, took damage from German fighters. With engines failing and unable to maintain position in the protective formation, he faced an impossible choice. Attempting to reach England meant certain death from pursuing fighters. Landing on enemy soil offered his crew's only chance of survival. He brought the 30-ton bomber down in a French hayfield. The Germans captured the aircraft intact, flying it to their testing center at Rechlin, where Luftwaffe pilots would spend months studying American defensive capabilities. But that story unfolded in Europe. In the Pacific, different lessons were being learned under different circumstances. The Japanese pilots who first encountered B-17 seconds in combat brought their own assumptions to these engagements. Fighter doctrine developed during operations over China and Malaya had proven devastatingly effective. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter, with its exceptional maneuverability and long range, had established air superiority wherever it appeared. Japanese pilots, supremely confident in their ASAC training and their aircraft, viewed bomber interception as a straightforward tactical problem. Attack from the rear, where defensive guns were limited. Close to point-blank range, where the superior agility of the Zero allowed precise fire with the 20mm cannons. Maintain pressure until the bomber's defensive fire ceased or the aircraft fell from the sky. These tactics had worked against Chinese bombers, against Dutch aircraft, against early British bombers in the opening months of the war. The B-17 would prove different. Warrant Officer Yoshio Oki, commanding fighters of the 251st Kokutai, learned this on June 16, 1943, when his unit intercepted a modified B-17E over Buka Island. The bomber, officially designated serial number 41-2000-666, but known to its crew as Old 666, had been extensively modified by Captain J. Zima and his crew. They had removed unnecessary weight, installed additional gun positions, and mounted 19 machine guns where standard fortresses carried 9 or 10. The engagement began as Oki expected. His 7-0 fighters, some sources report up to 17, climbed to intercept the lone bomber, conducting reconnaissance over Japanese-held territory. The Zeros made their first passes from below, testing the bomber's defenses. Standard tactical doctrine called for attacks on the tail where earlier B-17 models had been vulnerable. The modified tailgun position responded with devastating effect. Twin 50-caliber machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute, created a cone of fire that forced the attacking Zeros to break off their approaches. Oki adjusted his tactics. If the tail position was too heavily defended, attack from the front where bombers traditionally mounted lighter armament. The Zeros fanned across the bomber's nose, 3 fighters attacking simultaneously from the front, while 2 more pressed from the rear. This coordinated assault, executed by experienced pilots flying agile aircraft, should have overwhelmed the bomber's defenses. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented. The nose of Old 666 mounted not the standard single flexible gun, but multiple 50-caliber positions. The bombardier's chin turret, modified by Zima's crew, added concentrated firepower directly ahead. Twin guns in the upper turret could depress to engage frontal attacks. Even the cheek positions, normally single guns, had been doubled. Oki's Zero took fire immediately. 20mm cannon shells from the attacking fighters smashed into the bomber's nose and cockpit, wounding both the pilot and bombardier. But the defensive fire proved equally effective. Oki's aircraft suffered damage to its fuel tank, forcing him to break off the attack and return to base. His wingman followed. The remaining 5 Zeros pressed their attacks for over 40 minutes. They scored hits repeatedly. By the time the engagement ended, Old 666 had sustained 5 20mm cannon strikes and 187 bullet holes. 4 crew members were wounded, 1 was dead, but the bomber remained airborne, still under control, still fighting. The Japanese fighters eventually broke off, low on ammunition and fuel. Japanese records show no Zeros shot down that day, though 1 ditched early due to engine failure and 3 sustained damage from defensive fire. The Americans claimed 5 destroyed, a common discrepancy in the chaos of air combat where multiple gunners often fired at the same target. What matters is not the kill claims but the fundamental lesson. A single B-17, heavily modified and flown by an experienced crew, had survived sustained attack by multiple Zero fighters flown by pilots of the elite 251st Kokutai. Old 666 made it back to base, was repaired, and returned to combat operations. This engagement represented an extreme case. Most B-17 seconds in the Pacific carried standard armament and operated with standard crews, but it demonstrated the potential of the Flying Fortress's defensive concept when fully realized. Multiple heavy machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, operated by trained gunners willing to fight, could make bomber interception costly and dangerous even for skilled fighter pilots in agile aircraft. The Japanese had encountered this defensive philosophy before, in smaller doses. The tail gunner positions on B-17E models, introduced in early 1942, had surprised Japanese pilots accustomed to attacking earlier model fortresses from the rear. The addition of a proper tail turret with twin 50 caliber guns and armor protection for the gunner changed the tactical calculus. Rear attacks remained possible but required more careful approach angles and accepting return fire from weapons capable of downing a fighter with a single well-placed burst. The mathematical reality confronting Japanese pilots grew increasingly stark as American bomber development continued. A single 50 caliber round weighed approximately 1.6 ounces. At combat ranges, these bullets retained sufficient energy to penetrate the lightweight skin of Japanese fighters with ease. The Zeros, designed to maximize range and maneuverability, carried no armor protection for the pilot in early models. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single tracer round striking a fuel cell could ignite the entire aircraft. By contrast, American bombers absorbed tremendous punishment. The B-17's stress skin construction and redundant systems allowed aircraft to survive damage that would destroy most fighters. Engines could be knocked out without dooming the aircraft. Control surfaces could be shredded while the bomber remained controllable. Entire sections of the fuselage could be shot away while the aircraft continued flying. Saburo Sakai, the famous Japanese ace, described attacking American bombers with growing frustration. The 20mm cannons mounted on his Zero carried only 60 rounds per gun. In air combat, this translated to perhaps 6 or 7 bursts before ammunition exhaustion. The cannons fired slowly, approximately 500 rounds per minute, and their low muzzle velocity made accurate fire difficult against maneuvering targets. Sakai observed that shooting down an enemy aircraft was like hitting a dragonfly with a rifle, so difficult was the gunnery challenge. The 7.7mm machine guns mounted in the Zero's nose carried 500 rounds each and fired more rapidly. But these lighter weapons, roughly equivalent to 30 caliber rounds, proved largely ineffective against the rugged American bombers. Sakai emptied 500 or 600 rounds into a Grumman Wildcat during one engagement, utterly destroying the aircraft's tail section, yet the Wildcat continued flying. He reflected that a Zero taking that much damage would have been a ball of fire. This disparity in armament effectiveness became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. American fighters mounting 6 or 8 50 caliber machine guns could destroy Japanese aircraft with short bursts. Japanese fighters required sustained fire from their 20mm cannons to achieve similar results against American aircraft, and the limited ammunition supply meant pilots had to conserve their shots for crucial moments. For bomber interception, this created a tactical dilemma. Japanese pilots needed to close to effective cannon range, typically inside 400 yards, to ensure hits on the bomber. But closing to this range exposed them to the full effect of the bomber's defensive armament. The 50 caliber guns remained effective out to 800 yards or more. The bomber's gunners could engage attacking fighters at distances where the Japanese cannons could not yet return accurate fire. Formation tactics amplified this advantage. The American doctrine of flying bombers in tight, defensive boxes meant that attacking fighters faced fire not from a single bomber, but from multiple aircraft simultaneously. A Zero attacking one fortress might draw fire from 3 or 4 bombers, each mounting multiple gun positions. The mathematical probability of taking hits increased dramatically. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early March 1943 demonstrated these principles in action. 6 B-17 seconds of the 64th Squadron attacked a Japanese convoy at 10,000 feet. Zero fighters rose to intercept, using standard tactics developed over previous months of combat. The bombers maintained tight formation, each aircraft supporting the others with defensive fire. The engagement report noted that Japanese fighters machine-gunned some B-17 crew members who had parachuted from a bomber that broke up in the air. This brutality reflected Japanese fighter doctrine, emphasizing complete destruction of enemy forces. But it also revealed frustration. Despite aggressive tactics and numerical superiority, the Zero pilots found the flying fortresses difficult to destroy. P-38 Lightning escorts engaged the attacking Zeros, claiming 15 destroyed, while B-17 gunners claimed 5 more. Actual Japanese losses that day totaled 7 fighters destroyed and 3 damaged. These discrepancies in victory claims were common to all air forces. In the chaos of combat, with multiple aircraft firing at the same targets, accurate kill assessment proved nearly impossible. What remained undisputed was that the B-17 formations, despite intense fighter opposition, completed their bombing runs and destroyed significant portions of the Japanese convoy. The strategic objective was achieved. The bombers had penetrated defended airspace, delivered their ordnance, and most had returned to base despite facing fighters specifically designed to intercept them. This pattern would repeat throughout the Pacific campaign. Japanese fighter pilots, flying superior aircraft in terms of maneuverability, and often with numerical advantage, found American heavy bombers frustratingly difficult to destroy. The defensive armament, while not making the bombers invulnerable, imposed costs on attacking fighters that accumulated over repeated engagements. By mid-1942, at the Battle of Midway, B-17 seconds from the 7th Air Force conducted multiple attacks against the Japanese fleet. The high-altitude bombing proved largely ineffective against maneuvering ships. The bombers claimed numerous hits, but post-war analysis suggested they achieved at most one near miss. Level bombing from high altitude simply could not hit moving targets with sufficient accuracy. But the defensive capabilities of the fortresses impressed observers. Despite repeated interception attempts by Zero fighters from the Japanese carriers, the B-17 formations sustained minimal losses. The fighters found that attacking bombers at high altitude, where the thin air reduced aircraft performance, presented unique challenges. The bombers maintained speed and altitude, while their defensive guns remained effective. The Zeros, optimized for low to medium altitude operations, struggled to maintain the high speeds necessary for effective firing passes. Japanese fighter pilots adapted. They developed new tactics, emphasizing high-speed diving attacks that minimized exposure to defensive fire. They learned to attack from angles where bomber gun coverage was weakest. They practiced coordinated assaults where multiple fighters struck simultaneously from different directions, splitting the defensive fire. These adaptations helped. Japanese aces achieved remarkable success against American bombers throughout the war. Individual pilots shot down dozens of heavy bombers using perfected techniques, but these successes required exceptional skill, significant combat experience, and often tactical situations where bombers were isolated from formations or separated from fighter escorts. The broader strategic reality remained unchanged. American industry produced B-17 seconds at rates that replaced combat losses and steadily expanded bomber strength. By August 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces operated over 4,500 B-17 seconds worldwide. Japanese fighter production, while substantial, could not match these numbers while simultaneously replacing losses across multiple combat theaters. More critically, pilot training pipelines showed dramatic differences. American bomber crews completed extensive training programs before entering combat. Crews that survived their tour of duty, initially 25 missions and later 35, rotated back to training commands where they passed combat experience to new crews. This systematic approach preserved institutional knowledge and maintained average experience levels across units. Japanese fighter pilots flew until killed, captured, or physically incapacitated. There was no systematic rotation policy. Experienced pilots accumulated hundreds of combat missions, achieving remarkable individual success. But when these veterans died, their knowledge died with them. New pilots entered combat with minimal training, often with fewer than 10 hours in their assigned aircraft type. The result was a steady decline in average Japanese pilot quality. By 1943, many Japanese fighter pilots faced American bombers with inadequate gunnery training and limited tactical understanding. They attacked courageously but often ineffectively, dying before accumulating the experience necessary to develop effective techniques. This decline accelerated throughout 1944 and into 1945. American bomber crews in the Pacific reported encountering increasingly desperate attacks by Japanese fighters. Kamikaze tactics, initially employed by naval aviation against ships, reflected this same reality. When conventional attack methods proved ineffective and pilot skill was insufficient, ramming became a tactical option. The B-17 inches the Pacific theater never achieved the prominence it gained in Europe. The distances involved favored the longer-ranged B-24 Liberator for most operations. By mid-1943, most heavy bomber groups in the Pacific had transitioned to the B-24. The Flying Fortress continued serving in specialized roles. Air-sea rescue variants, redesignated SB-17, dropped life rafts to downed aircrew. Some aircraft conducted reconnaissance missions. A few remained in combat squadrons through the war's conclusion. But the defensive firepower lessons learned in Pacific combat influenced bomber design throughout the war. The principle of multiple heavy machine guns creating overlapping fields of fire, proven against Japanese fighters in the Pacific, became standard doctrine applied against German interceptors over Europe. The psychological impact cannot be measured in statistics alone. Japanese fighter pilots, reading intelligence reports about American bomber armament, understood the risks before takeoff. Attacking a formation of fortresses meant flying through a storm of .50 caliber fire where a single unlucky hit could prove fatal. The courage required to press these attacks deserves acknowledgement, even as we recognize the tactical futility of individual bravery against systemic industrial advantage. Consider the perspective of a young Japanese pilot in mid-1943. He has completed perhaps 50 hours of flight training, far less than American or British pilots receive. His aircraft, while maneuverable, carries limited ammunition and no armor protection. His fuel tanks can ignite from a single tracer round. He faces bombers mounting 13 machine guns each, flying in formations where 6 or 8 aircraft can bring defensive fire to bear simultaneously. The mathematics of survival are brutal. Each bomber can fire over 9,000 rounds per minute across its defensive positions. A formation of 6 bombers generates over 50,000 rounds per minute of combined fire. Even if most rounds miss, the volume of fire creates a probability field where avoiding hits becomes increasingly unlikely as attack time increases. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized closing to point-blank range for certain kills. But closing to 100 yards or less meant flying through several seconds of concentrated defensive fire. A Zero fighter measured approximately 29 feet in length, with a wingspan of 39 feet. At combat speeds, it presented a target that trained gunners could hit at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The attacking pilot had to maintain course and speed during the approach, unable to maneuver violently without spoiling his aim for the crucial cannon burst. The few seconds required to close from 400 yards to 100 yards, fire a cannon burst, and break away represented maximum vulnerability. The bomber's gunners concentrated fire on the attacking fighter during this period. Multiple gun positions tracked the target. Tracer rounds, typically every 5th round, showed where fire was concentrating. Gunners adjusted aim based on tracer observation, walking their fire onto the target. Against a single bomber, a skilled Japanese pilot could exploit brief windows where gun positions cycled through ammunition changes or the bomber maneuvered. Against a formation, these windows disappeared. While one bomber's dorsal turret paused to reload, another's waist guns engaged. The continuous fire from multiple sources left no safe approach angle, no moment of vulnerability to exploit. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The defensive tactics developed by American bomber crews evolved through combat experience. Early in the war, crews sometimes broke formation when under attack, believing dispersal would make interception more difficult. Experience proved otherwise. A bomber separated from formation became vulnerable to concentrated attack by multiple fighters. Alone, even with full defensive armament, the B-17 could be overwhelmed by coordinated assault. Formation integrity became the cardinal rule. Bombers maintained position regardless of damage or difficulty. The wounded aircraft, struggling to keep up on damaged engines, received support from neighboring aircraft in the formation. Their gunners concentrated fire on fighters attacking the damaged bomber. This mutual support system, while not guaranteeing survival, dramatically improved odds compared to solo flight. The combat box formation, developed through 1942 and refined through 1943, optimized this mutual support principle. 3 aircraft formed an element, 3 or 4 elements formed a squadron box, 3 squadron boxes formed a group. The vertical and horizontal staggering ensured that gun positions from multiple bombers could engage any fighter approaching from any angle. Japanese fighter pilots studied these formations intensely. Intelligence officers analyzed gun positions, calculated blind spots, identified vulnerable approach angles. Tactical manuals detailed recommended attack sequences. Hit the lead bomber first to disrupt the formation. Attack from 12 o'clock high, where gun coverage was historically weakest. Coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to split defensive fire. Some of these tactics proved effective when executed by experienced pilots. The introduction of the chin turret on later B-17 models directly addressed the 12 o'clock high vulnerability that Japanese and German pilots had exploited. The staggered waist gun positions improved gunner freedom of movement, allowing faster engagement of targets, but tactical improvements on both sides could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of attrition. Japan entered the war with perhaps 3,000 trained fighter pilots. American training programs produced over 2,000 pilots monthly by 1943. The replacement rate differential meant Japanese pilot quality declined as experienced aviators died, while American pilot quality improved as training programs refined methods based on combat reports. The captured B-17 seconds that Japanese engineers examined at Tachikawa Air Base near Tokyo revealed these systematic differences. The aircraft themselves, recovered from Java and the Philippines in early 1942, demonstrated American mass production techniques, interchangeable parts, precise tolerances, standardized construction methods that enabled rapid manufacturing. But the defensive armament represented more than engineering excellence. It embodied an entire philosophy of air warfare. American doctrine accepted that bombers would face fighter opposition. Rather than attempting to outrun or outmaneuver fighters, American designers focused on surviving fighter attacks through superior firepower and structural strength. The 1350 caliber machine guns on a fully armed B-17G represented approximately 730 pounds of weapons and several thousand pounds of ammunition. This weight penalty reduced bomb capacity and range. American planners accepted these trade-offs, judging that bombers needed to survive the mission as much as they needed to deliver ordnance. Japanese bomber design reflected different priorities. Aircraft like the Mitsubishi G4M, Allied code name Betty, emphasized range and bomb capacity over defensive armament and protection. These bombers carried lighter defensive guns and lacked armor or self-sealing tanks. They achieved impressive range and payload, but proved vulnerable when intercepted. The contrasting philosophies reflected different strategic situations. Japan, fighting across vast Pacific distances, needed maximum range from its bombers. The United States, with growing fighter capabilities and eventual air superiority, could afford to emphasize bomber survivability over maximum range. Japanese bombers often operated without fighter escort due to range limitations. American bombers increasingly flew with escort fighters that provided protection beyond the bomber's defensive guns. By late 1943, P-38 Lightnings operating from improved bases could escort bombers across most Pacific targets. By 1944, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs arrived in theater, offering even better escort capabilities. The Japanese fighter pilots now faced not only heavily armed bombers, but also capable escort fighters, whose sole mission was bomber protection. The evolution continued. American fighters adopted increasingly aggressive tactics, not merely reacting to Japanese attacks, but actively hunting Japanese fighters before they could reach the bombers. The WWII, developed by naval aviator John Thach before the war, proved devastatingly effective against Japanese fighters. 2 fighters working in coordination could protect each other while engaging multiple opponents. These tactical developments, combined with growing numerical superiority and improving pilot quality, gradually shifted the Pacific Air War decisively in favor of American forces. By 1944, Japanese fighters struggled to mount effective opposition against American bomber streams. By 1945, American bombers operated over Japan with near impunity, facing fighter opposition that was increasingly desperate and ineffective. The final missions of the war saw B-17 seconds operating in air-sea rescue roles, dropping life rafts to downed crews in waters off Japan. The bomber that had entered service as a coastal defense weapon in the 1930s concluded its combat career saving lives rather than taking them. Some crews completed entire tours without encountering serious fighter opposition, so thoroughly had American air superiority been established. The statistical record tells the story of attrition. The United States produced approximately 12,731 B-17 seconds during the war. Nearly 5,000 were lost to all causes, including combat, accidents, and operational losses. This represents a loss rate exceeding 38%. Yet, American factories continued producing replacement aircraft at rates that maintained or increased bomber strength throughout the war. Japan produced approximately 10,500 Zeros during the war. Most were destroyed in combat, on the ground during air attacks, or deliberately scrapped during the surrender. The production rate, while impressive given Japan's more limited industrial capacity, could not match American output while simultaneously producing other aircraft types needed across multiple theaters. More significantly, Japan could not replace experienced pilots at the rate they were lost. The elite fighter pilots who dominated the war's early years gradually died in combat or were reassigned to training duties as the pilot shortage became critical. Their replacements, often with minimal training, faced American forces growing in capability and confidence. The quality gap widened continuously from 1943 onward. The defensive firepower of the B-17 contributed to this attrition. Each bomber that Japanese fighters destroyed came at a cost in fighters damaged or destroyed by defensive fire. Each bomber formation that successfully completed its mission despite fighter opposition demonstrated that bomber interception was not a certain proposition. The psychological impact of watching experienced pilots die attacking these heavily defended aircraft cannot be quantified but surely affected morale and tactical decision-making. Some Japanese units developed near-suicidal tactics in desperation. Fighters would attempt to ram bombers when ammunition was exhausted or when conventional attacks proved ineffective. On December 1st, 1942, a Zero pilot, attacking a B-17E over Bougainville, deliberately flew directly at the bomber's nose at combined speeds exceeding 400 knots. The Zero tore completely through the bomber's fuselage just behind the wings, cleaving it in two. Both aircraft and crews were lost. This incident, while extreme, illustrated the desperation Japanese pilots faced. Conventional attacks against the B-17's defensive firepower required exceptional skill and favorable circumstances. When these conditions did not exist, some pilots chose ramming as a guaranteed method of destroying the target. This tactic foreshadowed the organized kamikaze campaigns that would emerge in 1944. The bomber crews experienced their own psychological pressures, flying missions lasting 6 to 8 hours or more, operating at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped well below freezing. Knowing that enemy fighters would attack at some point during the mission, watching other bombers in the formation explode or spiral down when hit, waiting for fighter attacks that might come from any angle without warning. The ball turret gunner, cramped in a spherical turret beneath the bomber with only plexiglass protection, had perhaps the most psychologically challenging position. The gunner entered this turret through the aircraft fuselage after takeoff, curling into a fetal position in a space approximately 4 feet in diameter. For hours, he rotated this turret tracking potential targets, vulnerable to any attack from below. If the aircraft sustained damage forcing an emergency landing, the ball turret gunner might become trapped, unable to exit before the landing. The tail gunner occupied an equally isolated position at the extreme end of the fuselage, separated from other crew members, unable to move from his station during combat. If the aircraft sustained damage to the tail section, he might be cut off from parachute escape routes. Both positions required crew members to overcome claustrophobia and fear while maintaining vigilance and combat effectiveness. Yet, these crews flew mission after mission. Some completed 25 or 35 mission tours and volunteered for additional tours. The sense of purpose, the belief in the mission's importance, the bonds formed with crew members, all contributed to motivation that sustained these men through conditions of extraordinary stress and danger. The Japanese fighter pilots experienced similar psychological pressures under different circumstances. They knew American industrial capacity exceeded their own. They understood the pilot training differential worked against them. They watched experienced squadron mates die while inadequately trained replacements arrived. Yet they continued flying, continued attacking, continued fighting against deteriorating odds. This courage deserves acknowledgement separate from strategic analysis. Individual bravery existed on both sides. Individual tragedies occurred in both air forces. Young men died far from home, fighting for causes they believed just, regardless of which flag they served. The human cost of the Pacific Air War transcended national boundaries and tactical considerations. The 50 caliber machine guns that made the B-17 a flying fortress represented more than technical achievement. They embodied American industrial philosophy applied to warfare: overwhelming firepower through volume, mutual support through coordinated action, systematic training that preserved institutional knowledge, industrial production that ensured material advantages. These principles extended beyond bomber defense. They characterized American military operations throughout the war. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan eventually employed B-29 superfortresses rather than B-17 seconds. But the B-29 incorporated lessons learned from B-17 operations, including heavy defensive armament and robust construction. The later bomber mounted 12 50 caliber machine guns, plus a 20mm cannon, ensuring it could defend itself against fighter interception. Japanese fighters attempting to intercept B-29 seconds at high altitude faced even greater challenges than they had against B-17 seconds. The B-29 operated at altitudes approaching 35,000 feet near the ceiling for most Japanese fighters. At these altitudes, aircraft performance degraded significantly. Maneuvering became sluggish. Climb rates dropped. Interception required perfect timing and positioning. The defensive armament remained devastating. The 12 50 caliber guns, while fewer than the B-17G's 13, were mounted in remotely controlled turrets with improved fire control systems. A single gunner in the B-29 could control multiple turrets, concentrating fire more effectively than independent gunners in separate positions. Japanese fighters found these later bombers even more difficult to destroy than the fortresses had been. By mid-1945, when B-29 seconds conducted regular raids over Japan, fighter opposition had declined to sporadic resistance. Fuel shortages grounded many fighter units. The surviving experienced pilots had been killed or assigned to kamikaze units. The new pilots lacked fuel for adequate training and died quickly when they did engage. The defensive firepower of American bombers, combined with escort fighters and overwhelming numerical superiority, had established air dominance so complete that strategic bombing proceeded with minimal interference. The story comes full circle to that December morning in 1941 when unarmed B-17 seconds arrived at Pearl Harbor during the attack. Those crews, landing through chaos with no weapons to defend themselves, survived through luck and Japanese pilots' focus on ground targets. 4 years later, American bombers operated over Japanese skies, with such superiority that Japanese fighter opposition represented negligible threat. The transformation required enormous resources, thousands of aircraft produced, tens of thousands of aircrew trained, bases established across the Pacific, supply chains maintained across vast distances, fighter development to provide escort, tactical doctrine refined through combat experience, all coordinated through systematic planning and industrial mobilization. The 850 caliber machine guns that gave the B-17 its defensive capability represented one component of this larger system. Without industrial capacity to produce ammunition, the guns served no purpose. Without trained gunners, the weapons remained ineffective. Without formations providing mutual support, individual bombers became vulnerable. Without fighters providing escort, even heavily armed bombers faced unacceptable losses. Success required integration of multiple elements into a coordinated whole. The Japanese understood this, intellectually. Their engineers examining captured B-17 seconds documented American production methods and recognized the advantages. But understanding and implementing are different challenges. Japan's industrial base, smaller and less developed than America's, could not match American output while fighting a multi-theater war. The captured B-17 seconds examined at Tachikawa taught Japanese engineers that defeat was inevitable once American industry fully mobilized. The defensive firepower was impressive. The production capacity behind it was overwhelming. One led to tactical challenges, the other determined strategic outcomes. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.